We're delighted to be here. I'd like to thank our hosts for including us in this conference. As you have seen from the program, this panel discussion is about China, and its title is No Strings Attached, with a question mark, Political Implications of China's Infrastructure Investments. China is a newer player in the European Union. It has quite a few infrastructure projects here as of late, but we are yet to find out exactly how China will shape this region and what its role is going to be going forward. So we've assembled a really great panel here, and our guests are going to tell us a little bit more about the nuances of Chinese involvement in Europe that we all need to keep in mind as we think about the future of the European Union and particularly of Central and Eastern Europe. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. We have Jacques deLisle. Can you hear me okay? We have Jacques deLisle, who is the director of the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute as well. He's also the director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. We have Chris Miller. Chris is my colleague at the Foreign Policy Research Institute also. He's the director of our Eurasia program. Chris is also assistant professor of international history at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. We also have Zeno Leoni here. He is a teaching fellow at the Defense Studies Department at King's College in London. And lastly, we have Liudas Zdanavičius. He is a research fellow at the Lithuanian Military Academy. So we're going to go exactly in that order. I'm going to ask Jacques to speak first. Everybody's going to get about 10 minutes, then we will converse for a couple of minutes among one another, and then we'll open up for question and answers. So I'd like to invite everybody to be active during Q&A, and please don't hesitate to ask anything you'd like to our speakers. So, Jacques, let's get started.
Well, thank you, Maia, and I'd like to thank the organizers for including me in this, and thank you all for staying after lunch. So the question I've been asked to address is a broad one of what to make of China's Belt and Road Initiative and China's foreign investment in Europe more generally. And I think whether one sees what China is up to as an opportunity, a threat, or less of either one of those than it may seem, sort of depends on how you understand the Belt and Road Initiative and where it fits into broader Chinese undertakings. There's a good deal of exaggeration so far about the significance of these projects. It started with Xi Jinping's announcement on a visit to Kazakhstan and a visit to Indonesia in 2013 of the Belt and the Road, the Overland Silk Road Economic Belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. Nominally, it's open to everybody. 70+ countries, depending on how you count it, have signed up for it in some way. About a third are in Europe. The One Belt and One Road actually consists of 6 corridors and 5 routes, and potentially there are several $1 trillion of investment involved. It reaches the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, the Baltic, and the Mediterranean, and it has been portrayed as a Chinese Marshall Plan for much of Eurasia. It's supposed to mark China's emergence as a provider of international public goods, and its goals include not just infrastructure, but also there's talk of the digital Silk Road, the Arctic Silk Road, and beyond investment into realms of policy dialogue, free trade areas, financial integration, telecommunications, people-to-people ties, and implicitly a Chinese place in the international institutional structure. Both formal institutions like the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and more informal groupings like the 16+1, now 17+1, of Central and Eastern European states and China. And China has invested a lot in this idea politically. It was written into the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee communique, which basically set forth an agenda for economic reform in China. It was written into the 13th five-year plan, and it is overseen by one of China's many central leading small groups headed by a member of the Politburo. It also was written into the Chinese Communist Party's internal constitution in 2017. So a lot of rhetorical investment, and so far many billions of dollars, although far short of the trillions we're talking about. And then there's a lot of overseas foreign investment from China that is only ambiguously related to the BRI, or perhaps not part of it, and this includes greenfield investments and acquisitions of foreign firms. But in some ways, the BRI is a lot less than it seems. Much of it is aspirational. Many countries have signed up as empty talk. People have called it a Christmas tree. You can hang anything you want on it. And a lot of pre-existing projects and projects that will never happen have been bundled into it because it's the phrase you attach to whatever you want to do in China because it's Xi Jinping's big foreign policy initiative. It's a little bit like in America shortly after the 9/11 attacks. If you put "end the global war on terror" at the end of whatever you were doing, you would get government funding and recognition, and that's kind of what's happening here. Economically, the BRI's significance has been quite limited, especially in Europe and especially for smaller countries like Lithuania. As noted, a lot of what's in the BRI agenda is aspirational. There are analyses of its potential, but much of this is not translated into fact. Activity under the BRI and Chinese investment more generally has been quite uneven. It's mostly been Asian. It's only in limited ways made it into Europe, and it's very uneven in Europe. The numbers I've seen have Lithuania something like less than 1.5% of even 17+1 trade, and 1% of Chinese foreign investment in that cluster of countries. So the direct impact is pretty limited, but I want to suggest that the indirect impact, the political impact, can be fairly significant. And what you make of those prospects or those risks depends in part on what you think China is up to in pursuing this agenda. And I want to suggest China has several motivations. There is an economic motivation, recycling accumulated foreign exchange from many years of trade surpluses, the attempt to promote export markets in a period when China's export-led growth strategy has started to run out of steam, an attempt to address excess capacity in some key sectors such as construction and steel, some tariff-jumping investment to get factories set up in Europe and elsewhere, and some attempt to support Chinese national champion industries. There's also an import side, lowering the costs of imports to China with better connectivity and diversifying sources of energy and other raw materials. The idea is also, more profoundly in some ways, to support China's economic transformation, to send the lower-end industry abroad, much as Japan did earlier in its development, to expand the market for higher-value Chinese goods and services associated with investments in infrastructure and other areas, and to promote Chinese firms as the standard setters in emerging technological sectors. It's also meant to help China develop its western frontier and to keep those western areas, Xinjiang and Tibet, more firmly integrated with China. Secondly, there are power calculations, great power competition. The BRI and Chinese investment to a significant degree reflect and enhance China's international role as a more powerful and assertive actor. China has become a global power. It no longer hides its brightness, but instead goes for the other slogan, 有所作为, that is to actively accomplish something. It's linked to Xi's China dream and the great goal of national rejuvenation. And it's a conscious counter in some ways to US efforts such as the TPP, the TTIP, the pivot to Asia and the free and open Indo-Pacific, as well as the Trump-era trade war and the declaration of China as a strategic rival. There's a prospect, thus, of China using its economic ties as political leverage with other states. And this high politics agenda has been focused mostly on Asia, but it's started to turn to Europe and other places. China's third goal is to reshape international institutions in ways that align better with China's interests and preferences. So we see China-centered international institutional structures like the BRI itself, the AIIB, and various things like the Silk Road Fund and other China-led development banks, as well as giving China a bigger voice in established institutions. Then there are less formal arrangements like the 17+1, which has put some strains on EU unity on some fronts. So the concern here is China is a threat not just to important institutional structures, but also to the values that those structures embody and reinforce. And this is the fourth Chinese goal, to enhance Chinese soft power or sharp power and its influence on international norms. The idea here is that overseas foreign investment and the BRI are part of China's quest for and are among the material underpinnings of China's normative influence in the international order. A buzzword in Chinese foreign policy today is huayuqian, which translates as discourse power, the ability to influence the way people talk and think about things. And the attempt has been to portray China as a benign actor. Xi Jinping's community of common destiny follows on such other tropes as a harmonious world, peaceful development, and China's peaceful rise. So we see here an attempt to revive China's rather depleted soft power, and we saw this especially at the second BRI forum earlier this year, where it was all about win-win cooperation and trying to assuage the concerns that some partners in Asia, in particular in the BRI, had about these projects, debt trap diplomacy and so on. China here continues to emphasize the old 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. That's essentially a pro-sovereignty, don't interfere in anybody else's internal affairs view of how to behave internationally. But therein lies a challenge to status quo liberal norms and the institutions that embody them, the normative order that the US and the European Union have long supported. At minimum, China is seeking a more pluralist international order. At maximum, it's trying to make the world friendlier to political autocracy and state-managed economies. So quickly, as I'm running out of time here, let me turn to the risks and the responses to them. There are economic risks. Infrastructure projects notoriously fail. The Chinese side may not follow through on commitments. Too much money may be lost and projects abandoned. China's not very good at risk management. There's a lot of easy money kicking around, and so these projects may turn out to be not so viable, especially given the nature of legality and institutions in many of the targeted countries. This can include debt traps, although I don't think it's fair to say that China has a debt trap diplomacy agenda. There are also issues of Chinese ownership of critical infrastructure, be they ports or energy infrastructure or transportation links. Second, there's a cluster of host country political and social costs and risks that are related to no strings attached or non-conditionality. It can contribute to corruption in host country governments. There are problems with environmental impacts and social and economic dislocations in areas where Chinese firms bring Chinese practices into targeted countries. It's especially an issue with the BRI, but it extends to other foreign investment as well. Third, there are systemic or normative costs. The erosion of liberal good governance norms in some countries that have received Chinese foreign investment, particularly BRI projects, and the undercutting of liberal democratic rule of law values as foreign policy agendas. These are things that occur through a variety of mechanisms, including China's use implicitly or explicitly of its economic leverage to push a political agenda. The effect in part has been to pressure some European governments to acquiesce in Chinese positions on various international issues. It scuttled European Union unity on the South China Sea arbitration case. It creates some pressure to tone down human rights critiques, and some incentives, some pressure to accept or acquiesce in Chinese positions on Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, and most recently the protests in Hong Kong. There are also Chinese pressures more generally to be less zealous in pressing liberal economic and political norms internationally, ranging from anti-corruption to democracy promotion. And here the effects can be indirect. Whatever Lithuania's policy is, it sits next door to Belarus and various other countries which may change their views on China. These risks are made worse by the problems of strains on European Union unity on how to deal with China. The risks are made worse by the China-Russia alignment on many of these issues, and they're made worse by the unraveling of what had once been a closer US-EU alignment on how to deal with both China and Russia. And finally, the risks are made worse by China's acquiring some of the tools for influence in the democratic politics of other countries that are, in terms of tools, if not yet agenda or actions, and maybe never, somewhat similar to Russia's. In those areas where China thinks it understands domestic politics, Taiwan and Hong Kong, you're seeing similar uses of social media, disinformation, and so on. Finally, in closing, what can be done about this? These risks I don't want to exaggerate. They are potential risks in most cases. In some cases they're real, but it really varies, and it varies by country and by project. So what can we do about it? Most of them are pretty obvious, and I'll just take a couple seconds to go through these. First, host country unilateral measures. On BRI projects, engage in debt risk management, project-specific feasibility studies, environmental and social impact studies, and transparency and open bidding processes without favoritism to Chinese firms. Enforce compliance on any FDI project with local laws on government procurement, anti-corruption, environment, labor, and so on, and involve stakeholders and public input. Undertake national security scrutiny of inbound foreign investment, particularly in critical infrastructure, and use public-private partnerships or multilateral development banks in conjunction with China's AIIB to raise compliance and best practices. Second, press China to live up to its own commitments. It has pledged a clean BRI, a green BRI, sustainable development, a code of conduct for Chinese firms. It opposes corruption and opacity at home and should extend those values to Chinese firms working abroad. Third and finally, multilateral efforts. For BRI-type projects, Chinese development banks can be urged to meet international best standards. The EU can attempt to speak with one voice, as its white paper has urged. and the EU can pursue its own alternatives, such as the Asia Connectivity Strategy, which doesn't have no strings attached, and it can seek renewed cooperation with the US, perhaps not with the current administration, but perhaps a later one. And in more general, just sort of redoubling the European commitment at a general policy level to a liberal, rule-based international order. Thanks.
Thank you, Jacques. I'm going to ask Chris Miller to make his remarks next. Speaking of China-Russia alignment, Chris is writing a book about Russia-China relations that's going to come out really soon, so keep an eye out for that one as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Maia, and thanks, Jacques, for opening up the conversation with such an overview of the Belt and Road. I agree with almost everything that you said, and I think it's so important that when we look at Chinese investment abroad, we realize, as Jacques said, that there are many different causes of why China makes the decisions that it makes, and thus many different ramifications for what this investment has. And as Jacques mentioned, I'd like to underscore the importance of the different institutions in China that are pushing to invest abroad. You have private companies, you have the central government, and they all often overlap in certain projects, but they all have different interests. And so when you're trying to understand China, it's important not just to look at China, but the different interests within China that affect Chinese decision-making, because this also, of course, affects whether Chinese investments have political ramifications, and if so, what these political ramifications actually are. What I'd like to do is pick up on a couple of the specific points that Jacques raised and look more at their political context. The first is the extent to which China is able to use leverage vis-a-vis smaller countries. One of the things that is obvious in dealing with China is that it's a massive country in terms of population, of course, as it always has been, but also in terms of economic weight. It's now the second largest economy in the world. It could at some point potentially become the largest economy in the world. And so for medium-sized or small countries, this is, of course, a difficult country to deal with just because of its size. There's no way getting around that. And when you look at Central and Eastern Europe, this issue is, I think, particularly important. When you're a country with a 10th or a 100th or a 1000th of the population of China, you've got to be strategic as to how you engage with it. And this is not specific to China. This is true of any large country, but I think especially for China, this bears taking in mind. When you look at Europe's strategy towards China thus far, I think what's been remarkable is, until very recently, the lack of strategy. There's been a desire among most member states to go their own way on relations with China. When there have been Brussels levels conversations about China, they've been lowest common denominator in terms of their outcome. And this has been, I think, from the European perspective, a very dangerous route to take, because every European country is small vis-a-vis China. And especially when you look at countries like Lithuania, they're quite small in comparison with China, and so could use all of the leverage they can get from a pan-European strategy. Now, of course, this is complicated. It's hard to get Brussels to agree on almost anything, especially an issue as multifaceted as our relations with China. But as we see China playing a larger role in the region economically, and as we see China turning its larger economic footprint into diplomatic and political leverage, it becomes more and more important for Europe to speak with one voice. And that's not just important for Europe, it's especially important for smaller countries, because the only hope they have of having a voice with Beijing is through Brussels. There's just no other way it's going to work. And so when I look at the discussions in Brussels about China, I sense a shift over the past couple of years to taking a more strategic, long-term, unified viewpoint, but I think there's still a very long way to go on that front. And of course, each member state has its own interests. Some think about China more in economic terms, others think in more strategic terms, but finding a way to have a consensus and forge a consensus among the different European member states seems to me to be absolutely crucial to having a China policy at all. Otherwise, small countries dealing with a country as massive as China simply won't be able to get Beijing's attention, and China will rightly presume, I'm afraid, that it can pick off individual countries and try to undermine European unity in the process. So I would encourage all of you to think about not only what is Lithuania's strategy towards China, but really what is the European Union's strategy towards China, because the European Union is a large enough institution to deal with Beijing. It can get China's attention in a way that smaller countries will just inevitably struggle to do so. Now, when you do look at the shifts that have been happening at the European level vis-a-vis China, I think there are some interesting changes over the past couple of years, but there are also some interesting divergences with the US that are worth keeping in mind. So I mentioned a bit of a change in Brussels and in many European capitals towards seeing China not only as an economic actor, but also as a strategic actor, an actor with foreign policy ramifications that matter not just to East Asia, but also to Europe itself. And that's been true. It's been visible in many European countries over the past couple of years, but what's been even more remarkable from my perspective is how the conversation in Washington has changed even more rapidly than the conversation in Brussels. So although Europe is looking at China through a slightly more strategic lens, in Washington the rhetoric is primarily of not cooperation with China, but competition with China. So the transatlantic gap on the China question, I think, is actually widening. It's widened over the past couple of years. And this is quite dangerous for anyone who thinks that transatlantic cooperation is important, as I do. And certainly in places in Central and Eastern Europe where there's a deep concern about Russia and the importance of NATO unity on Russia, transatlantic gaps on China could spill over into other questions. And that's something that needs to be managed very carefully. Now, obviously, the current administration in the United States is on one, I think, extreme of U.S. spectrum and views towards China, but I think it would be wrong to think that even if a Democrat wins in 2020, the U.S. is going to swing back towards Obama-era policy on China. And so managing this enduring, I think, U.S.-EU gap in terms of threat perceptions and concerns about China will be quite important, not only for policy vis-a-vis China, but also for policy vis-a-vis other issues, including Russia, which is an area that's, of course, great concern to people in this region. And that's where I'll turn to the third point on looking at the China-Russia alignment that we've seen over the past couple of years, deepening, expanding into a variety of different spheres of cooperation. In the U.S., there's often a question of, do Russia and China have an alliance? And I always say, well, no one in Beijing or Moscow uses the word alliance to describe their relationship. But it's undeniable that they have a partnership that's become far deeper over the past 5 years, especially since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And this is something that certainly in the United States, and I'd be interested to hear from people in this audience, but in the United States the view is often raised that, well, China and Russia have a history of warfare, therefore they will inevitably fail to get along in the long run. And I say, well, maybe that's true, but the long run could be a very long time in the future. And for the short term at least, I see very few factors that are going to drive Russia and China apart, especially so long as both Beijing and Moscow see the United States, the European Union, NATO as their primary challenges in the international stage. So long as Moscow and Beijing are focused on the United States, they'll have every incentive to downplay any disagreements they have so that they can be unified against what they see as a common challenge. And this creates, I think, increasing challenges for the West in general, for not only the United States, but also NATO and the EU, to think about what are the ways that China and Russia are collaborating internationally to support a collective agenda. We see this, for example, on internet censorship norms at the United Nations and in other bodies. We see this on questions in Central Asia, downplaying the importance of human rights, and I think we're likely to see it on an ever-growing set of issues over the next couple of years as China and Russia continue to deepen their collaboration. This isn't going to be an alliance where they agree on every issue. It certainly won't be an alliance like NATO is an alliance, but nevertheless it would be wrong to underestimate the durability, at least in the short term, of this relationship and the extent to which it could cause us more challenges and create less unity at the international level in dealing with the issues that we think are important. So I'll wrap up there with that discussion of China and Russia, but I look forward to the discussion after we hear from the rest of the panelists.
That's great. Thank you so much, Chris. We're going to turn over to Zeno Leoni, who has a PowerPoint, so he will speak from the podium.
Okay, so this is the outline of my presentation. I'm glad to hear that we're having a non-ideological discussion about China, because that's what I was planning to do. And in fact, as you will hear, with the previous guest, my conclusions are kind of mixed with regard to China. So there are some areas for concern, there are other areas about which we shouldn't be concerned. So I'm used to look at international relations through the lenses of empires, and so I'm interested in seeing whether Chinese owned or Chinese controlled infrastructures in Europe lead to some kind of what we call re-territorialization of the Chinese state in Europe, that is some form of direct influence. And so I wanted to have a brief look at different areas where China might have an influence, a direct influence on European countries, and then to raise some critical points on the European Union. Okay, okay. So in terms of military and strategic influence, I think the hegemonic aspiration that China has in the Asia-Pacific are quite clear, quite obvious. I think in Europe, given the early stage of the Belt Road Initiative, it's still early stage, it's still too soon to draw a conclusion in this regard. And for example, one of the questions I was asking myself is, these Chinese-owned infrastructures, for example, the port, the Piraeus port in Greece, will they become potentially military installations, or will they be used for military purposes one day, as we see this happening in the South China Sea, for example? I don't think there is any evidence of that yet, although I found interesting last summer to see that China is starting to cooperate with Germany in terms of paramedical armored expeditions, probably thinking at humanitarian interventions one day. But I think it's still very, very early stage, although it's something that we can consider. So I wouldn't draw any hurried conclusions in this regard. Instead, with a bit of imagination, speaking about Europe being concerned strategically with China, we can look at the geography of some of these investments, and we can see that Europe is basically becomes kind of surrounded on its flanks, where most of the trade with Asia is happening. And so we know that there is the Duisburg freight line going into Germany, and so there is a kind of logistic arch. That's how I imagine it. We see the Duisburg freight line going to Duisburg, into Germany, on the eastern side of Europe. We see in Israel infrastructure being built that might one day allow to bypass the Suez Canal, so strategically very important, built by China, okay? And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier on, the Piraeus port and the Italian ports of Palermo, Vado Ligure, and Trieste, where China wants to build a platform that will allow big cargos to have access to those still small ports. And so, so in a way, yes, so Europe might become kind of surrounded in that regard. I think, yes, so that's what I was talking about in terms of the geography of Chinese investments. Yes, so the situation is also mixed in terms of political influence. And so historically, of course, if we look at how countries vote at the United Nations, historically, the countries endorsing China are mostly Asian and African countries. So as I said, the Belt and Road Initiative is still very early stage. We cannot really draw conclusions here, but it was interesting to see last summer what happened with a letter sent out by about 20, 30 UN ambassadors trying to challenge Chinese policy, security policy in Xinjiang towards the Muslim population there. So we can see, as you probably read on the news, we can see that countries like the UK, Germany, France, the Baltic states signed that letter. Many other Asian and African and Latin American countries signed another letter challenging the first letter, so defending China de facto. But then most interesting, we find that some countries like Italy and the rest of the CEE country, the rest of the CEE members didn't sign any of those letters. So what does that mean? That's something interesting to know. But speaking about direct political influence of China in Europe, we see that, funnily enough, the countries that are most exposed to Chinese trade, the countries that have the highest states when it comes to China, the countries where China is investing the most, are those who signed that letter challenging Chinese policies, security policy in Xinjiang, and so the UK, Germany, France. So that means what was mentioned earlier on, that there are some countries that have, because of their size, economic power, at least at this stage, they're still able to uphold on, to hold on their foreign policy strategy, their foreign policy values, while there are probably economically weaker countries which don't have that possibility. In terms of socioeconomic influence, I agree with what Professor deLisle was saying. So I think the situation here is a little bit clearer. So Chinese companies are challenging the international order at the level of law politics, at the level of values, and that's where, in fact, the battles between the United States and China is fought. It's a battle of muscles, well, it's a battle of rules behind which we find muscles, but at this stage it's a battle with regard to international rule of law. So we find, for example, as we know from fieldwork of some researchers, that in the Piraeus port, unions, journalists, they struggle to have access to the Chinese-owned areas. This is a way for one way to challenge the international order, which is also an order made of rules and of rule of law. And in fact, if you study the American hegemony, as I did, you'll see that it's not just about military power. On the contrary, compared to previous hegemons, there is a great emphasis on international rule of law. So China, I think, wants to bring that shape that rule of law in a way that is more convenient to its economic model. And speaking of shaping the rules of international rule of international order, I think we can talk about the role of sovereignty in China's foreign policy. For many years, it has been crucial, sacred, and it still is. So I doubt we will see China intervening militarily in a European country or anywhere else at this stage. And yet, I think this understanding of sovereignty has become more flexible. So China respects the sovereignty of other countries at the very high level, but then at the lower level, where, for example, standards of labor lies, China can challenge that. It can challenge values and culture and so on, rather than intervening militarily. Just wanted to highlight a final aspect in terms of investments. We get very concerned with China, but we need to think that so 30% of the European assets are owned by foreign companies. So one should ask, okay, so why we are concerned with China when Canada and the US, for example, have a good deal of, own a good deal of debt or have investments in those assets. On the other hand, one might say that Chinese control of those assets has grown quite quickly over the last 10 years. But just to be precise, I think that China has only 9%, Chinese company only owns 9% of that 30% that is owned by foreign companies. And I wanted to highlight, I think it's very important, another aspect which was mentioned earlier on. So China is buying everything, is investing across the full spectrum of business, and that reveals a weakness rather than a strength, because China has to deal with overcapacity, overaccumulation of capital, and that's probably, many think this is the real engine of the Belt Road Initiative, so finding a safe valve to that overcapacity. So I think we are wrong if every time we see China or a Chinese company or even a state-owned company buying something in Europe, pointing the finger and saying, oh, there is a grand strategic logic behind that, there is a geopolitical logic. I'm not saying it is unfair, I'm just saying that probably is not accurate. So in conclusion, I'm not entirely sure, as somebody did, as many people do, that we can talk about a new Silk Road trap. So a trap has a binary relationship. So there is who organizes the trap, there is who falls into the trap. So it's up to both actors. I wanted to point the finger, from a personal point of view, against austerity. So if China is strong anywhere in the world, but particularly in Europe, this is because the continent has become poorer compared to 20 years ago, and particularly at the local, regional, provincial level, we find so many politicians keen on embracing investments, even when these investments might not be reliable, might be, inappropriate, short terms, and so on, in order to impress their own voters, their own people. So I think resolving the problem of the fiscal compact, of austerity, is key to have a healthy relationship with China and with any foreign investors. Otherwise, Europe will always be we will always have a weak negotiating powers. I also think government should take more control rather than less control, as it has been done over the years, of some strategic sectors. Again, I'm going back to the Piraeus example. You can lease it out, but it needs, you can allow investments in your strategic infrastructure, but they need to be controlled, and they need to be short-term, and renewal of those investments eventually need to be assessed carefully, but I don't think it's the case. And in general, my view, that's my final point, is that the European Union has the right legislation to deal with that. It has the right policy, but then this is not implemented. And so again, I would take it back to the fact that economic necessity, financial necessity, then ultimately prevails on legislation. And I would leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you. We have very punctual speakers. I like that. We're going to turn it over to Liudas, who will hopefully give us a little bit of a local glimpse into China's relations with Europe, specifically from the perspective of Lithuania.
Okay. We heard already quite broad explanations what's going on about the global and the regional processes. And Lithuania is the case study, but I would say that Lithuania also is pretty interesting case study because it's a way different from some Belt and Road Initiative countries and those 17+1 countries which often overlap each other. Because, and here in case in Lithuania you see both Chinese and Russian factor very visibly. So, but first I want to talk a little bit also from the theoretical perspective, because other speakers have spoken, do we need some, I don't know, like ideological approach, but how can we actually analyze Chinese economic presence in Lithuania, but also in other European countries? There are both approaches and the mindsets in which decision makers believe at the same time, so, or we can use the word paradigm. So first one is geoeconomical. Often the word economic statecraft is used. This approach is very often used by the national security community, like intelligence agencies, ministries of defense, and so on. Some part of politicians. Another one is liberal neoliberal. And here you, in both cases, you even hear the different words used. For example, here in one case you hear about the threat, infrastructure, strategic, flows, something. And in second part, second approach, you can hear this famous citation of Xi Jinping, win-win, yeah? Win-win opportunities. Even when you analyze such simple thing, economic thing as trade, which aspect of trade for you is the most important? Balance of trade, which is usually very negative, as I will show you later. Or you will talk about the growing turnover of trade, yeah? Volume. Volume is growing, but what is the structure? It's another question. And here you see on this side, when we talk about decision makers, usually those are like ministries of economy, ministries of transportation. I'm not talking only about Lithuania. Most of the European countries is more or less the same. And there is a broad range of explanation why it works that way. And this duality actually translates in the decision-making process. What it means? That almost in all countries you can see arguments of the both sides. Final decisions is another question. what decision was made. It depends on the status quo in the different country, but still. And very often you have the combination of those two approaches. For example, in Lithuania we also have some kind of combination. In Greece another combination. In Hungary the third, and so on and so on. Then, but because China is a Marxist country, I think Marxism here has also something to say. No, Marxism in the broad sense of this word. You know, there is this so-called structuralist theories which are seeing the world as the structure of center and periphery and semi-periphery. And here I have questions to which I don't have the full answers, but I think the questions by themselves have very important explanatory power. So, China, is it core country or it's center country with high added value already, or it's semi-periphery? And then in this case, if China is the center, what is the Europe here, European Union countries? We see the deindustrialization, technological sluggishness in some sectors, but in others we are still leading. It's kind of mixed picture, yeah? So what is the role of our countries, 17+1, in this field, and Lithuania specifically? Are we part of semi-periphery? What is the structure here? And agents of influence. There are different words for them. For example, you know that China had the century of humiliation. Maybe they are replaying the century of humiliation, just change the direction. We remember what was the place of Shanghai, of Hong Kong at that time, Xiangan, as it was called. Then, what are the issues when we talk about the Lithuania, which are once again quite similar to many other Central and not only Central and Eastern European countries, but Western European countries. So, first, transportation, foreign trade, 5G, so ICT more broadly, and financial sector very often. So not all of them are infrastructure, as is the name of our panel says, but still. So first is, what is the trade structure? And actually, when you see at the 17+1 countries, in the most countries the situation is the same. Huge imbalance when the exports to China are much lower than imports from China. And we perfectly remember how on one high level meeting between Chinese, I think Xi Jinping and the President of Poland, they discussed how to export more apples to China using those frameworks. Results were quite poor. So, what are the main problems in case of Lithuania? You see it here. I have much more slides, but I will explain, but you can take a look. And here you see our situation. The export to China is more than 4 times smaller than the imports from China. When you look at the structure, and China is a very minor partner for Lithuania. To put the numbers in the context, it's very interesting. Very often we talk about the leverage, the trade as the leverage tool. And we in Lithuania have a very good example of trade with Russia. In 2013, as you perfectly remember, later those so-called counter-sanctions in 2014, actually volume of Lithuanian milk products export to Russia was considerably higher than our current total exports to China. So leverage is still quite small, but as you see, there is the tendency of growth, and it's still growing. But the trade deficit is also growing, despite everything, because the base. But let's go to more. I don't know why it's not working. Where is this computer? Where? Okay. So, could the trade be used as the leverage? And in case of Lithuania, we already see that despite the small amounts, there is you know, a lot of analysts are asking the question, if Chinese leverage is actual amount of trade or it's some promises. And in case of Lithuania and many 17+1 countries, we talk about promises very often, because as you see, the numbers are still low. But the two most famous cases we see, the meeting of Grybauskaitė with Dalai Lama and access of Lithuanian milk products to the Chinese market. There are some other examples. It's interesting how it will be developed later, this question, because we have a lot of developments this year, as you perfectly know, here in Lithuania, and it will be interesting to see. And this is another example. But on the same time, you have, on the one side you have stick, on the other side you have carrot. For example, Lithuania was the third country in the European Union which got the access of wheat to the Chinese market. But still we are not exporting a lot of this wheat, but still it's symbolical. Then, very important sector, I would say number one issue now is the transportation sector. And here we have a few issues. First one is the port of Klaipėda. And first, possibility of acquisition of some terminals or maybe operating rights, theoretically. Then another question, possible Chinese investment in the deep water port or so-called outer port. It's maybe now it's not very actively discussed, but maybe this question can be discussed in the future once again. Another related question is, are we on transit route from China to the European Union? And as you know, 95% of the transportation rail transportation goes through Poland. Duisburg was mentioned, this backbone line. So we are close, but we are not on the main line. But still, just recently we received the 100 train. But when we analyze the actual volumes, they are still negligible compared to the whole turnover of Klaipėda port, for example. Related question is China and Rail Baltica. I called it in Lithuanian language, sorry for this misspelling, but for example, you know that there was an announcement about investments in the tunnel, Helsinki-Tallinn tunnel. Are they for real? It's another question, I don't know, but it changes the dynamics of this project a little bit, and Chinese companies before were interested in the construction contracts here. What's more, Great Stone project in Belarus, it's in the development phase. There is a discussion what is the future of this project. Will it become some kind of major manufacturing hub, or it will stay some kind of shallow, hollow project? I don't have an answer here, but still it has some potential impact. Then, financial sector. Lithuania talks a lot about itself as kind of fintech hub, and we already have some Chinese companies in Lithuania. There is possible access through Lithuania to the European Union payments market, but still the numbers are comparatively low to other European countries. The Luxembourg here is definitely leading, regulatory frameworks and so on. That's more 5G. This is a very important issue, and in the most European countries you see this discussion. As you know, now the question went to the European Union level, because European Union institution needs to produce some kind of recommendations for all countries what to do with this issue. But I have more fundamental question. There is a need for some kind of hurry in this project per se? Because 5G is important for the countries with the high population density, for the big cities which have shortage of the capacities. In Lithuanian case, we have no such problems. Maybe it's important for some kind of technological development, but once again, I don't know. Okay, and once again, as in many countries, potential economic benefits versus national security consideration. As I have told you before, neoliberalism versus geopolitical interests. Current government Lithuanian government position. It's very simple. Chinese market is important for us. It's an important economic player, but we need to have some safeguards. And the safeguards are this regulatory framework, the law on the protection of the objects of importance to the ensuring national security, and there are safeguards on investments, on the acquisition of shares, of the big, some kind of big tenders, development of the territories near the strategic sector companies, and so on. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. There's a lot to unpack here, so let me just ask one question before I turn it over to the audience. I want us to spell out a little bit more why it is problematic for Europe specifically that China and Russia are getting closer, and why that makes China's role in the European Union more problematic. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more. Chris, we could start with you.
Well, I think when I look at China and Russia getting closer together, one of the key challenges for Europe is getting agreement on what the priorities are. And you have this at the NATO level, you have it in the EU level. Different member states have different interests. And when you ask the question of how do you devise a strategy that relates both to Russia and to China, that problem is magnified because you have two very important questions, and it's hard to get all of the key states to agree on what to prioritize. It's hard enough to have a Russia strategy or a China strategy, but it's even harder to have a coherent strategy that addresses both of them. And so that's where I think it's crucially important to realize the linkages between the two countries on certain issues. So I mentioned before, looking at internet norms and governance across the world. That's a key area I think that has been influenced by the two countries' cooperation. On economic issues as well, there's increasing cooperation, but I think it's important to understand that linkage, and when you're devising your strategy to one of the countries, either Russia or China, you need to understand the linkages between them. Unless you do that, you're going to have this issue of prioritization emerge at every step of the way. So I'd say that recognizing the challenge is probably step one to confronting it.
Yeah, I would agree with what Chris just said. I would just add to it a little bit that at some level, values are kind of the glue for what has held Europe together and has held transatlantic values together, and China and Russia are both in the process of challenging and destabilizing those values. And I mean that as a descriptive, not a normative statement. I mean, I happen to like those values, but whatever you think of them, it is an agenda that wants to at least make for a more plural order, and quite possibly for a revisionist order eventually. And I don't have to tell this audience, there are already strains within Europe about countries remaining on the same page, so I think it just exacerbates that problem. Also, one doesn't want to accelerate the dusting off of Cold War mentalities, and I think I share with Chris the view here that it is unfortunate how much and how quickly, how extremely the view in US policy circles has changed on China. I mean, yes, there are real problems that probably did necessitate a course correction, and it started under Obama, it accelerated under Trump. But one of the virtues of Russia and China not being fully in alignment is they both have to worry about each other a little more. And now that doesn't really seem to be a problem. I mean, there was a time not long ago when Putin was very wary of China's rising influence, and then he kind of decided to make peace with it, not least because of concerns with the US. So there is a kind of almost triangular structural logic that is, not Cold War, but it's got a touch of that logic to it too, I think.
Sorry, I just wanted to add that we clearly, to understand this, particularly in terms of why Europe is concerned with China, it's not just about that, but we also need to bring in the role of the United States and the transatlantic alliance. And I think this is one of the reasons why this factor is creating a lot of the important divides and big debates within each country. So, for example, Chris, you were saying that Europe should be united, and That's a big problem. We need another panel for that. So but it's not just division between countries. I think there are also divisions within countries. And you see, which is striking from my point of view, you see the business community, increasingly upset with the United States. It's something totally new to my memory. And then you see the security community kind of more closer to Washington, to the kind of strategic inputs that arrive from Washington. And I think Trump is trying hard to, for example, with Israel and other countries, Germany, Italy for sure, to be an obstacle within the cooperation between these countries and China. It's a very difficult mission for him, I think.
Thank you. I want to open up for questions from the audience, so let's start from the front here.
Victoria Rusinaitė, Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis. Thank you for this topic, super interesting. I would like to ask two questions. So the first question is, could Chinese investments through 17+1 format draw a wedge between Eastern and Western Europe, and what could be done to avoid this, if this would happen? And then the second question goes to Liudas Zdanavičius. You showed a picture of President Dalia Grybauskaitė meeting with the Dalai Lama in 2013. Do you think such meeting on such high level would be possible today? And if not, then what has changed and how policy changed towards China recently, maybe? So yeah.
Thank you. Those are excellent questions. Why won't we start with you, Liudas?
Okay, starting from the second question. I'll tell you honestly, I don't know, because we have the new president, and on the other hand, Lithuanian government position is, as I said, it's quite balanced here. I don't have the answer for you. I really don't know. If it will happen like next year, we can analyze it from. But on the other hand, this year we can see quite developments. For example, Lithuania was part of this letter of ambassadors on Xinjiang, which is, I would say, quite important sign. Then talking about this investments, first we need to understand that actual size of the investment in most of the countries is really low. In the most cases, we are talking about the promises, opportunities, possibilities, importance, such words. For example, in Lithuania, we had maybe not very broadly publicized, but there was discussion on possible 200 million euros Chinese investments in Kaunas electricity plant, coal, which would use the coal, yeah. In 2017, I think it was discussed, but now we hear nothing about it. The same, even all those very famous projects, such as high-speed rail from Piraeus to Hungary. It's moving very, very slowly. And the same, we can talk about many other possible projects. That's why I'm asking the question, what is the future, for example, of Great Stone? We have both achievements, and on the other hand, we have some questions. Thank you.
Great.
Well, I would just reiterate on the question of promises versus actual investments. There's a great team of researchers in Washington at the Center for Strategic International Studies that have looked at the amount that China says will be invested via the Belt and Road versus the amount that has actually been invested, and what they find that the promises are something on the order of 10 times the reality, which is a stunning gap between reality and promises. But actually, the promises are politically very important, and I think puncturing this myth that China is actually coming around and handing out free money to everyone is important to actually understanding Chinese policy, because the free money is not really there, especially in this part of the world, in Central Eastern Europe. I've seen actually far less free money than other parts of the world. And once we begin to understand that, I think we can actually more accurately assess what China's capabilities actually are.
In answer to the first question, I mean, I think it's a fairly obvious checklist, but it's worth keeping in mind. Yes, certainly it is a threat, and I think China sees it as a threat to use the 17+1 structure for obvious reasons. 17+1 is a group of mostly smaller countries, and it overlaps in that complex Venn diagram with the EU. So it's roughly 2/3 EU, 1/3 not, and it includes on the EU side some of the countries that are least with the program of maintaining EU standards in a variety of ways. So of course it's leverage there. What can the EU do about it? I mean, I think it can undertake its efforts to use its observer engagement with 17+1 to try to press on those issues. It can try, as Chris was just saying, to make clear the need to be sober about the limited upside and some of the downsides. And of course, the ultimate leverage is that the EU controls the admissions of those countries that are in the 17+1 that aren't in the EU, and there is the risk that if one receives through Chinese investments some of the effects that we've seen in eroding good governance type standards that comes with some of the more undeveloped countries, less developed countries that received assistance, that's going to make the task all the harder. But yeah, it's a struggle to, as Chris was saying in his initial remarks, but an important one, to avoid what is a venerable Chinese strategy of trying to do things one on one or one on a few. And the EU is the entity that has the scale and the clout, if it hangs together, to press back. And there are not that many entities out there that can. The US is one when it chooses to. The EU is another. Russia could be, but isn't right now. And Japan, I think, has faded considerably on that front. Maybe India is rising on that front. But there are not really many collectivities or entities that can go toe-to-toe with China on setting the rules of the international system or shaping the key institutions.
But it does raise a question, I think, for countries in Central and Eastern Europe that are or have been part of 17+1 or 16+1 beforehand, which is, what's the point? What's the benefit exactly of participating? If you get the division of Europe, if you're not getting the investment, why are you showing up to these meetings? I think that's a fair question that ought to be asked that isn't asked nearly enough.
Yeah, it would also be interesting to given that some of the CE are within NATO, it would be interesting to see at some point whether will they go, because I guess they will have to take a decision. That tension will have to be resolved at some point. But I just wanted to add that it's not difficult to divide Europe nowadays. There is a divide on migration between North and South. There is the divide on Russia. The divide on fiscal policy, and then there is a divide on China for sure, and it's even, as I said, it's even dividing countries from within, so yes, it will certainly create that wedge.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question. I don't see the microphone. Oh, there we go.
You can't hear me. Okay, I'll try it. Okay, it's working now. And I apologize for my slurred speech because of medical reasons. Anyhow, so I am deLisle from Lithuanian Parliament, and I'm actually very interested to find out your opinion. Can Hong Kong's situation influence opinion of Europe and United States of Western world towards relations with China, depending on the level of force that they are going to use, and what do you think the implications might be?
Hong Kong's a subject near and dear to my heart. I did my first academic writing really on it. I think it could. I think one of the reasons that we've seen the escalation of conflict in Hong Kong recently is that the authorities in Beijing are less concerned about international criticism than they used to be. And that has, in a sense, raised the stakes because the protesters in Hong Kong have really only two weapons. One is to make Hong Kong unworkable and ungovernable, but that is a somewhat suicidal effort to influence Beijing. And the other is to get the outside world to pay attention. The point of getting the outside world to pay attention is usually to bring pressure to bear on China. That's the game of the protesters toward the UK and the US. But I think your question gets to a point that has gotten less attention, which is the broader reputational impacts on China. I'm skeptical about how much of an impact it will have, simply because there are a number of issues which, if one wanted to seize on China's political or human rights behavior, that would seem to energize that. I mean, Xinjiang certainly hasn't. And I think there is a certain recognition that the ability to influence Chinese behavior is somewhat limited, and I think that has reduced the willingness or the incentive of other governments to try to bring pressure to bear on China. That's not necessarily true for civil society, and I think that's an interesting thing to watch. And then to follow up on one of Chris's earlier points, China has been very active at the Human Rights Council in Geneva in trying to undercut some of the criticisms of NGOs and others, so it's another area of norm destabilization, and we see China in recent years, this predates Xi Jinping, but it's accelerated. We see China in recent years pushing back against the universal human rights values that it had in principle accepted in 1991.
If I could clarify the question, talking about the reaction of Western world, but also, do you see the risks that if China sees that nobody actually is really caring about the consequences, that might actually give another wave of their very aggressive expansion, and what would you think would be the price for all of us?
Sorry, I didn't get your question entirely then. So, yeah, I mean, I think at one level, I think Xi Jinping has, partly by temperament and partly by a consequence of China's growing power, become relatively unconcerned. Doesn't think there's going to be that much pushback. Whether that translates into China's quasi-imperial assertiveness or something, I don't think we know yet. I wouldn't project that out, simply because every place that China has taken a very hard line on these issues are areas which China claims are Chinese territory. That's accepted in Tibet and Xinjiang. It's not so fully accepted in Taiwan, or to a degree Hong Kong, which has a kind of funky halfway status. But China's been careful to forego claims to anything beyond that. But yeah, I think that as one of the earlier questions got to, I think the pressure has been pretty effective on not getting other countries to take up the sword or to really do much about it. The Dalai Lama visits are one of many examples.
Sorry, did anyone else want to comment on this?
Yeah, so very briefly, in terms of comparative analysis, so if we look at what happened 30 years ago in Tiananmen Square, and then we could compare it to Hong Kong somehow, and yet the reaction, there wasn't much in terms of impact from the Western world. And so, yes, I don't expect at this stage to have a great impact to trigger any particular reaction. And regarding China, after the incidents of these days, China is not saying, okay, we can negotiate something. I think the other day, Xi Jinping at the celebration for the 70th anniversary of China said the contrary, that actually Hong Kong is part of China, right? So I don't predict any change from China either.
Thank you. Liudas?
I can make a short comment. I think that China actually, the fact that there is still no Chinese military openly operating in Hong Kong means something. They still takes world opinion into consideration. They are demonstrating somewhere in the stadiums in Guangdong province, yeah, but are not acting as in some other Chinese regions. Of course, there is no great firewall in Hong Kong, at least on the full scale operating. That helps a lot and changes the dynamics, but still, and I would say that that changes opinion. At least China got the attention. The question, how deep is the impact, but still they got the CNN effect on this issue. For example, some other questions in Chinese domestic policy have not received such attention.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question, right over here.
Thank you. I will have a remark that concerns to what has been said by Liudas. on different approaches, political approaches, energy approaches, but what was also said on need to have a European stance, right? As Chris mentioned. If you look at the attitude of European Union towards, for instance, Belt and Road Initiative, which has the name initiative, but in my opinion it's not initiative, it's strategy. And the answer needs to be strategic one, because it's strategy. If you look at the European Union stance, at the beginning, it was rather hesitant. European Union was rather hesitant, and European Union also criticized those who were involved in the 16+1. But then, something changed. Then, European Commission came with this famous Juncker plan. You know, huge investment plan that counted on, you know, fiscal pumping money in order to increase GDP growth. And the plan counted on more than 300 billion of euros. And only then, European Union started to think of possible merits of Belt and Road, because Chinese were ready to provide 10 and 15, up to 15 billion of euros. So my point is that it is very much with different political approaches. If you have in Europe political approach that focus on budgetary discipline and investment in new technologies as a source for GDP growth, then you are more resilient to external threats than if you count on massive fiscal investment in order to boost your GDP growth.
Thank you. Does anyone want to comment on this, or should we?
Very briefly. Actually, you know, there are a lot of popular sayings about the decline of Europe, but no, we can, in some aspects we can see that, sadly, but we can see decline of the deindustrialization of some regions, at least, technological sluggishness. It makes Europe vulnerable. Another question, what to do with that? I fully agree with the comments here. If we will just try to save, Russians have word, when you are saving the money for your funeral, yeah? Should we save for funeral, or should we save for some kind of escape plan, or I don't know, like jump, technological jump? Thank you.
Thank you. Chris?
Just one thought on the fiscal question, on the austerity question that was brought up earlier. I mean, it seems to me that you have to differentiate between countries, but right now Germany can borrow and get paid by bondholders to borrow from them. So if Germany were to issue a 10-year bond and put the money in the bank, German taxpayers would make money on that transaction. So it's kind of incredible that Germany is able to get paid to borrow and yet still won't borrow. And so if I were a European and looking at the Chinese offering money for roads or for bridges, for technology, and European firms and pension funds and individuals will pay Germany for the right to give Germany money, I would ask my German colleagues, well, perhaps you can do some borrowing and build roads and invest in technology for me rather than having us rely on Chinese technology. That seems like a much more sensible proposition. And the fact that Europe hasn't been able to convince the Germans to borrow, even though Europeans are paying the German government for the right to borrow from them, seems to me to be the height of absurdity. I struggle to understand Germany's logic when being paid to do something and still refusing to do it.
Thank you. Why won't we move to the next question, please?
Vilnius, Lithuania Foreign Minister. Naturally, in this region, you will be asked about Russia. And I would want just you to expand on some of the remarks I think some of you made on the China-Russia cooperation, how much it affects, you know, US and Europe. But I'm also, in the same way as I was asking question before lunch, ask you to look a little bit ahead to see for the future, because one of the scenario among many others is growing China would be also a problem for Russia. We see now expanding China's investment in Far East of Russia, you know, China taking pieces of forest from Russia, and so on. There are other means of influence where Russians might be unhappy, to say least, but even worried or threatened. So do you see, any of you would see this possibility that Russia eventually will turn to the West as far as they cooperate to vis-a-vis of expanding China? So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Get out my crystal ball. You know, we've seen some interesting shifts, and that Chris alluded to this in his comments, that you've seen mixing and matching of different countries or groups of countries on seeing China as an economic opportunity or an economic threat, a political threat, or politically not quite so scary. And so the notion that China is a political threat, I think, is widely shared. The US certainly sees it that way. Parts of Europe certainly see it that way. Russia has submerged that view for the time being, but I think it's still there. So the question is, when will that resurface with Russia? And whether Russia will start again to see the economic role as a threat. And it wasn't that long ago that they did. I mean, Putin is a relatively recent convert to this Eurasian Economic Union view. Before that, there was this concern about huge Chinese investment, particularly natural resources in the east, and the population gradient where, you know, there's nobody on the north side of the Chinese-Russian border, there are billions of people on the south, a lot of paranoia. Could it shift? Sure, and it's kind of the Kissinger logic, which, you know, had the U.S. Quasi-align with China to check Soviet power, and some of the Trump agenda, of course, to establish better relations with Russia is ostensibly to check the China threat. Now, there may be other motivations as well that we won't go into here, but these things are fluid and dynamic, and they can shift around. But I think, as my colleagues on this panel have also said, it would be wrong to characterize China-Russia as an alliance rather than an alignment of convenience, and those are always vulnerable to shifting on the basis of calculations. And at least so far in Russia, there are not the problems of democratic political pressures constraining what the top leader chooses to do in foreign policy.
Maybe 3 points to add on that, because I agree with everything that Jacques said. But one, on the question of Chinese investment into Russia. You've seen an increase in Chinese investment into Russia, notably in the energy sector. But I think what's actually most striking is how little Chinese investment there has been in Russia. Not because Russia hasn't welcomed it. Russia would love Chinese investment, especially outside of the energy sector, but Chinese don't want to invest in Russia. And of course, why would you? There is going to be no growth for the foreseeable future, and you might get expropriated at any time. So the same reason that Europeans don't invest in Russia and Americans don't invest in Russia, the Chinese don't want to invest in Russia very much either. So I think Russia's concern is actually not too much Chinese investment, but rather not enough. There's been disappointed at how little money the Chinese have brought. On the question of the Far East and Siberia, there was a lot of concern in Russia a decade ago about migration from China to Russia. And you often heard people say, you know, there's over 1 billion people just south of the border. What happens if they start marching north? And what's happened over the past decade is that, depending upon what measurement you use, by some metrics, Chinese wages are higher than Russian wages. I was in Vladivostok last year and heard numerous stories of Russians illegally migrating to South Korea and then getting deported after a certain period of time because they could make more money illegally working in South Korea than they could in Vladivostok. So if you want to talk about the decline of the Russian economy, I think that's a great anecdote to describe it. And so when wages are so low in the Russian Far East, why would anyone from China or anywhere else in Asia want to move there? Reality is that when you look at the data, there's no massive inflow of Chinese workers. There's some Chinese tourists, there's a bit of cross-border trade, but it's not the massive influx that Russians were quite concerned about a decade or two ago. In fact, the problem in the Far East is still the opposite. Russians who live there are desperately trying to move to Moscow or elsewhere in the country where there are actually better economic prospects. So when you put those two facts next to each other, that the threat from China that Russians were quite worried about a decade ago is not really materializing, plus the reality that both China and Russia are very focused on what they see as the challenge that the United States poses to them, I think there's not reason to think in the short term that the China-Russia relationship will get more complicated. If anything, I think it's likely to get closer, at least over the next couple of years.
All right, let's take the question in the back, please. If anyone else has a question, please raise your hand. I want to gather the last couple of... Great, thank you.
My name is Razma. I'm advisor to the president. Last week, European Union and Japan signed an agreement, a big chunk of which is dedicated to the development of infrastructure. My question is, to what extent Japan can act as a counterbalance to China's economic and political expansion in Europe? Thank you.
I've read about that agreement. I don't have much to comment, but I think it can counterbalance very little, given that even the US does not have the financial capacity to counterbalance the kind of offers that the Belt and Road Initiative has for its partners in terms of magnitude, financial magnitude. So I would say very little, but maybe I'm not well informed.
Well, I would disagree slightly. I think Japan could actually play a quite substantial role in a number of different spheres. So one is that you've already got trade negotiations going on, both the EU-Japan FTA, which was signed last year, but also trilateral trade negotiations between the US, the EU, and Japan at the WTO over data regulation, for example, a number of other spheres, which could be quite important if you have 3 of the world's 4 biggest economies setting rules of the road for technology and the internet. That will create rules that we like and stop China from creating rules that we don't like first. So I think that's one sphere where cooperation with Japan is quite important, and especially because the EU and Japan have a track record of not only negotiating but signing and ratifying trade deals. So that's one sphere. I think a second sphere is in Central Asia and also Southeast Asia, where Japan has a very long-term presence and it's respected in the region, not necessarily for offering the dollar values that China claims it's offering, although as we've said, China actually only delivers 1/10 of that, but by providing quality and reliable infrastructure. And so Japan actually has its own answer to the Belt and Road, which is called the Quality Infrastructure Initiative, emphasizing what Japan can deliver, which is high quality, but also needling the Chinese by pointing out that Japan's quality is higher than China's. I think that too is something that Europe can offer. Europe has a similar reputation for quality, well deserved, and so cooperating with Japan in Central Asia and elsewhere in Asia seems like a very wise strategy to me. And I would add a third thing. At a time when US-EU relations are in a complicated state, and they'll probably remain that way for at least the next year and possibly longer, it makes sense for Europe to work together with like-minded powers, and Japan is an obvious country. It shares an interest in a rules-based order, it shares democratic principles, and so it seems to me to make a lot of sense for Europe to focus on Japan as a partner, especially when it thinks about China.
We talk a lot about those investment projects, you know, counterbalancing, but we should understand one very simple thing. Are the projects profitable per se and have the economic logic? Because you can build some kind of very big multifunctional center in the village, as we very often have in Lithuania, but there are no people, no, I don't know, kind of possibility later to make normal amortization of this project and so on. So the same with those infrastructure projects. You know that considerable part of high-speed rail of 27,000 kilometers in China are making losses all the time. Many other projects, which project could be profitable with participation of China? If China will provide some kind of cargo turnover or a kind of subsidy or local contracts, but you should always count what are the costs and benefits. Because, you know, if there is really a profitable project, even the private capital will come. And you already mentioned all those pension funds. There is no shortage of money anywhere in the world. Huge flows are flowing everywhere. The other problem, how to make it productive, long-term, something which creates economic growth, export flows, I don't know, growth of economy, jobs, and so on. If you will just build the railroad from nowhere to nowhere in the middle of depressive countries, where the previous railroad just died because of you have nothing to transport, I don't know, can we call it investment?
Yeah, just add to that. I mean, I think that what my colleagues and your question have underscored is China has the scale advantage and the cost advantage, and these other sources have regulatory and sometimes construction and technical quality advantages. The nice thing about Japan getting back into this is that where the US has kind of absented itself from the field, and we have the USA Build Act, but that's not really significant. And where Germany is not following Chris's advice, Japan is actually stepping up, and that's kind of an Abe era notion of Japan trying to resume more of a role. So if you can get Germany to move forward, the US to get back in the game, and Japan does this, collectively that could be a real rebalancing effect.
I think we may be okay to take a couple more quick questions before we move on to the next panel. So why won't we just take both questions one after the other together, and then we can answer them, and we'll be out of time after that. So there's 1 and 2.
Hello. Yes. Hello, my name is Aurala Mikaita. I'm a political science student here in Vilnius, and I have a few questions. First, thank you for being here, of course. Okay, so first, maybe where Lithuania should stand when it comes to foreign direct investment into outer Klaipėda port. You talked briefly, Liudas, about Klaipėda, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. Considering the fact that it would be like a lot of economic benefits if China invests in it. And other more maybe broader question, what is the possible future impact of a new EU-level screening framework when it comes to foreign direct investment? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So let's take the next question as well, and we can answer them all together.
Thank you. Konstantinas Andrijauskas, representing Vilnius University. I do have a very short remark on the China threat thesis on the other side of the Russo-Chinese border. There is quite a lot of that going on, and this is my direct recent observation. It is not that much related to investment or the physical Chinese presence, though. I totally agree with that, but it's very much about the scramble of resources. And the big deal in this regard is water, Lake Baikal, and particularly timber. Because the forest fires, the wood fires, they're being blamed on the Chinese and the local corrupt officials who supposedly cover up the theft, massive theft of timber that goes directly to China. So this is the big news in today's Siberia and the Russian Far East. And a very short question on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which has not been mentioned, I believe, since it is probably one of the most clear-cut institutional manifestations of the BRI in many ways. What would be your take on that? Is it a threat? Is it an attempt to divide the Western world as well, since many of American allies, including major European countries, they are signatory members of the initiative? Thank you.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time, so let's really quickly answer those questions we had. Port of Klaipėda first, if anybody wants to take that.
It's a very long speech, but I'll try to be brief. The most important consideration here is national security question, because Klaipėda has strategic importance for our arrival of our allies in possible of any kind of situations here, and what is the cost for the national security could be serious here. On the other hand, economical possibilities, because in order to have this new outer port fully loaded, you need to double cargo turnover of the Klaipėda port. Where you will get such cargo flows, it's another question. You know that the possible investment is up to 1 billion of euros, and annual profit of Klaipėda Port Authority is, if I'm not wrong, something like 50-60 millions. So.
Sure, I'll take a stab at the AIIB question. I think I at least mentioned it a bit in my remarks. I think the AIIB, like other things that China has done, at the moment gives China an option. That is, the AIIB so far has not done all that much, and much of what it has done has been co-lending with other multilateral development banks, or has been adhering to World Bank and other standards. So there's nothing per se there to be terribly worried about. And the United States in particular created an opening for China to do this by opposing World Bank and IMF reform, which would have rebalanced and brought China more into that structure, or at least put China to the hard test of whether it wanted to set up its own institution or work within existing ones. So right now, partly thanks to the US, the Chinese can say, we have this institution here. It's not status quo threatening, but it is a Chinese-influenced institution. China has a share roughly equivalent to, I think actually larger than the US share in the World Bank. And so that's, that's an option to use that kind of leverage, and we'll see what they do with it. But for now, it's been a defensible move. I think the more pessimistic reading is that if you look at it in terms of a cluster of many other Chinese moves, where China has more openly done things that are inconsistent with status quo norms, mostly in non-economic realms, but some in economic realms, then this could be a lever for pursuing that agenda.
Could I add one thing on
Yes.
AIB? It's often discussed in the context of Belt and Road, but when you look at Belt and Road lending, almost all Belt and Road lending does not come through the AIB. And so China can justly say that the AIB has relatively high standards, it fits international patterns, but most Belt and Road lending doesn't have those standards because it goes to other institutions. And so I think it's wrong to put the AIB in the same category as Belt and Road, because AIB has high standards, but it's a tiny, tiny share of Chinese lending. And most Chinese lending comes through institutions like the China Development Bank, which has no rules whatsoever. As far as we can tell, is basically just run as kind of a slush fund for the Chinese Communist Party. And so that's, I think, the institution we must worry a lot more about, because that's where the money's coming from, and no one has any idea how it functions.
On that note, we are unfortunately out of time. I would like to thank our panelists. I would like to thank the... But let's also thank the Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis, who has hosted us for this wonderful conference and brought together so many interesting people. So thank you for having us, and enjoy the next panel.